The phosphorus lie. Why the world is about to starve. The grocery store shelves looked totally normal the morning prices doubled, then the frantic calls started. Wheat contracts were collapsing, farmers were canceling seed orders, and a river downstream turned a bright, toxic green. You might not believe one nutrient could cause all that chaos, but here's the thing, phosphorus isn't exactly trending on Twitter. When the world runs short of this one mineral, dinner gets canceled for everyone. I mean, seriously, we spend all day arguing about gluten while the backbone of our food system is quietly burning down. Without phosphorus, crops stall out, seeds don't form, and harvests fall off a cliff. There are billions of dollars on the line, and the clock is ticking. We're pulling back the curtain on the Morocco Western Sahara monopoly. The corporate spin, the Toledo water shutoff, the grave-digging history nobody taught you, and the EV battery squeeze. And the fixes that actually work if we move now. The God element, why life runs on phosphorus. To understand how we got into this mess, look at what your cells whisper every second, ATP. Phosphorus is the P in adenosine triphosphate, the tiny rechargeable battery that pays for every move your body or a plant makes. Snap one phosphate off, get energy, stick it back on, store it. That powers every heartbeat, every root tip, every grain filling out in a summer field. It's not just ATP either. DNA and RNA are held together by a phosphate backbone. Bones and teeth, calcium phosphate, seeds, packed with phytic acid, a phosphorus savings account. There's no substitute, no swap, no knockoff. You either have phosphorus or life slows to a crawl. Plants are incredibly picky about their timing, especially early on when those tiny roots are still figuring out where to go in the dirt. They need phosphorus for energy transfer and cell division right at the start. And if they miss that specific window, you can't really make it up later in the season. Farmers know this deep in their bones, which is why they place fertilizer as close to the seed as possible to make sure they chase every last bushel. When they get the timing right, the roots explode through the soil and the plants set way more flowers, which makes the final yields jump. When things go wrong, you start seeing purple corn leaves and stunted wheat next to empty pods, and that is what I call a silent fail. Here is the catch. The stuff we spread on our fields doesn't just appear out of thin air like magic. We have to mine phosphate rock from sedimentary deposits that were laid down over millions of years in ancient seabeds, and then we turn that rock into fertilizers like MAP or DAP. You shouldn't mix this up with elemental phosphorus, which is a dangerous industrial material made in massive, white-hot furnaces. Farmers only care about plant-available phosphate, and that entire pipeline runs from the rock mine through acid plants and into the granules that eventually hit the soil. It is a one-way stream that disappears forever unless we find a way to grab what leaks out of the system. You might be surprised to learn that we actually cannot synthesize new phosphorus no matter how hard we try. We managed to snatch nitrogen from the sky using the Haber-Bosch process, but phosphorus is an element, which means geology sets a hard ceiling on what we have. What is sitting underground is all we are ever going to get, and the reality is that not all rock is created equal. High-grade ore is the easy, clean stuff that makes fertilizer cheap, but as those grades drop, you have to dig more and use more acid. This leaves behind bigger waste stacks, and as the costs creep up, the pollution gets worse too. That is why people are starting to worry about peak phosphorus, because it isn't that the planet is running out of atoms, but rather that the affordable supply can't keep up with our hunger. We have already seen some scary glimpses of what happens when the market gets tight. Every time global food demand jumps or fuel prices spike, the phosphate markets start to twitch and act crazy. Farmers are always the first ones to feel the sting, so they start delaying their fertilizer applications or cutting their usage rates. The result is that crop yields begin to wobble and food prices at the store start to rise, which is exactly how a quiet mineral becomes a full-blown kitchen table panic. Meanwhile, there is something else happening deep in the soil that most people never notice. For decades, we spread way more phosphorus than the plants could actually use in a single growing season. A lot of that extra material locked onto soil particles and built up over time, which scientists call legacy P. You can think of it as a slow-motion savings account hidden in the dirt. And the good news is that smarter farming can actually tap into that reserve. The bad news is that heavy rain can wash it all into the nearest river where it feeds massive algae blooms. Now we are essentially paying for it twice, once to buy the fertilizer and again to clean up the mess it made in the water. Now, remember, this isn't just a science story, it's a map of power. High-grade phosphate is spread unevenly, and a huge chunk sits under North Africa. Most of it is concentrated in Morocco and the disputed Western Sahara, where the state-backed giant OCP runs the pits, ports, and plants, controlling the chain from the mine to the bag. That's massive leverage when farmers from India to Europe need what comes off that desert conveyor belt. Here's a fun fact. Seeds hoard phosphorus so aggressively that how we process food shuffles the mineral in weird ways. We grow feed, give it to animals, ship the meat across the world, and dump the bones far from the fields that grew the grain. Cities flush it, lakes bloom with slime, and dead zones spread when nitrogen and phosphorus arrive together like gasoline and a lit match. Because apparently, we're world-class at moving nutrients exactly where they shouldn't be. And then we act shocked when the bill shows up. So you might wonder why we don't just engineer our way out of this problem with fancy technology. People are certainly trying, and we're seeing new crops with roots that can unlock bound phosphorus or microbes that help the plants eat better. There are even enzymes like phytase that we put in animal feed so that less phosphorus ends up wasted in the manure. These inventions definitely help, but they don't change the base reality that biology needs this element every single season. You can stretch a tight budget as far as you want, but you simply cannot print new atoms. What nobody realized the first time the prices spiked was how quickly the cities and big companies would start pointing fingers at each other. The farmers say they need the chemicals to feed the world, while the water utilities say they are stuck cleaning up whatever flows downhill. The fertilizer executives claim it's just a temporary logistics problem, and meanwhile, regular households see their grocery bills jump and assume it's all just corporate greed. There is probably a little bit of truth and blame to go around for everyone, but the laws of physics really don't care about our feelings. When that high-grade rock supply tightens up, every single person downstream is going to feel the pressure. To understand how that grip on our food supply actually formed, we need to travel to the desert. That is where a 100-kilometer conveyor belt carries the rock of ages out to the sea, and we need to rewind to the last time the world chased phosphorus like it was pure gold. The Morocco monopoly, OCP, and the rock of ages. Imagine endless wind and grit and a single conveyor that never stops. At the Boukra mine in Western Sahara, massive machines drop rock onto a belt that runs nearly 100 kilometers to the Atlantic. It looks like a moving horizon of phosphate rolling toward ships that feed farms half a world away, but that belt is more than steel and rubber. It's geopolitical leverage you can see from space. The blunt math of the situation is that most of the world's high-grade phosphate rock sits in Morocco and the territory it occupies, Western Sahara. While experts might argue over the exact definitions or estimates, the center of gravity never shifts because this specific patch of North Africa holds the ultimate mother lode. Sitting right on top of all that wealth is OCP, a state-backed giant that runs the pits, the chemical plants, the ports, and the international contracts. They don't just sell raw rock, but instead provide finished fertilizer from massive complexes like Jorf Lasfar, where rail lines bring in slurry while acid plants hum and granulation towers spit out DAP and MAP like candy. This is vertical control from one end of the chain to the other. Do you remember that sudden price spike you felt at the grocery store recently? If we roll back to 2008, phosphate prices shot up several times over, and the same thing happened again in the early 2010s and during the 2021-2022 season. Farmers everywhere delayed their purchases and food prices surged. Yet in the middle of all that chaos, OCP booked record-breaking revenue. This didn't happen because they broke the market, but because when demand runs hot and alternatives are thin, the player sitting on high-grade ore and massive plants gets to set the entire tempo. Whether it is India putting out tenders or European buyers looking for a deal, OCP stays at the table to lock in long-term deals and keep ships moving while smaller producers start to blink. But here's where it gets messy. Western Sahara isn't just a desert full of rock, it's a disputed territory where the Sahrawi people claim self-determination. European courts have flagged cargoes as conflict phosphate. Some buyers quit entirely, pension funds divested, activists track ship names in real time. OCP says the mines bring jobs and development. Critics say the resource is taken without consent to finance an occupation. And through all of it, the belt keeps running. Inside the country, the strategy for OCP looks less like a company plan and more like a massive national project. They invest in everything from lifting ore quality to building fertilizer plants specifically tailored to the unique soils of their customers. Because they have state backing, they can use patient capital to bankroll research and create custom blends for African markets while dredging ports and securing power lines. When other countries start to wobble due to export bans or gas shocks, OCP leans in to grab more market share. It is a brilliant business move, but it also functions as serious geopolitical muscle. What most people outside of the industry didn't see right away was the quiet power of ore grade. High-grade ore saves a fortune on acid and energy while cutting out impurities like cadmium that regulators absolutely hate. As other regions are forced to mine lower-grade rock, their costs go up and their environmental headaches start to multiply. Morocco can keep its profit margins fat while everyone else is sweating, and that gap eventually becomes a matter of government policy rather than just simple pricing. The EU is constantly worrying about both fertilizer security and contamination limits, which forces importers to weigh the cost against the ethics of the source. India has huge subsidy bills and millions of small farmers who need a predictable supply, so you can bet the phone lines to Casablanca stay very warm. Across the world, competitors are desperately trying to claw back some relevance in this market. China has plenty of rock and capacity, but they often throttle their exports to protect their own domestic supply and keep local prices down. The US has companies like Mosaic and plenty of tariffs, but they also deal with limited high-grade ore and a mountain of internal politics. North Africa still holds the ace in this game, and every time the Bukra belt turns, it transforms grain by grain into leverage you can actually feel in bread lines. There is a human layer to this story that never shows up on a corporate balance sheet. You have miners working in the desert wind, dockworkers watching dust drift off a ship's hold, and farmers in India hitting refresh on a tender price. A co-op manager in France might be wondering if the next cargo will clear customs without a massive lawsuit, proving these aren't just abstract ideas. They are the living edges of a global system held together by rock, acid, and a mountain of paperwork. Here's a fun fact. A single conveyor belt can actually shape what an entire continent eats for dinner. However, that conveyor lives inside a legal gray zone and a harsh climate reality where storms shut down ports and droughts snarl hydropower. When OCP decides to flex its muscles, they can smooth out the bumps for some people while squeezing the margins for everyone else. When they stumble, the ripple effect is absolutely wild. And the market finally realized that a global resource was actually just a choke point with a flag. The stakes here are incredibly high for everyone involved. If exports slow down because of a strike or a court order, prices jump and small farmers are usually the first ones to cut back on their fertilizer. Yields begin to sag and food inflation follows shortly after, which forces governments to spend more on subsidies and less on everything else. Even if the supply keeps flowing, the fight over the ethics of Western Sahara isn't going away anytime soon. To understand how we got so vulnerable to a single belt in the desert, we have to look back at the last mad dash for phosphorus. It was a time when ships chased bird dung and people literally dug up the dead just to feed the living. Guano to glory, the first phosphorus rush. Picture ships edging up to islands that look like giant loaves of sugar. As the crew gets closer, the smell turns sharp and sour, like a chicken coop baked in the sun for a century. They're not hunting gold or spices, but mountains of bird droppings on Peru's Chincha Islands in the mid-1800s. This was the first great phosphorus rush. Did you know that guano is loaded with so much nitrogen and phosphorus that it could turn a dying field into a green carpet overnight? For years, farmers had been barely scraping by using basic manure, but then samples from the Pacific reached London and yields suddenly exploded. Contracts were signed instantly, and the Peruvian treasury began to swell with cash. Whole shipping lines switched over to the guano trade because the profit margins were simply too good to ignore. Here's a fun fact. The US actually passed the Guano Islands Act in 1856. I mean, seriously, Congress basically told citizens that if they found an unclaimed island covered in poop, they could plant a flag and the military would back them up. Dozens of tiny specks in the Pacific and Caribbean were claimed almost overnight, even if they were just rocks with a few birds. Crews would land and set up ramps to start scraping away at a nutrient bank that had been building up for thousands of years. But this rush came with a devastating human cost. On the Chincha Islands, the labor was absolutely brutal for the convicts and kidnapped workers who had to shovel under a white-hot sun. The dust was so caustic that it burned their lungs and eyes, while overseers pushed for higher and higher quotas. Ships were loaded day and night as the piles of guano shrank and the money poured through Lima like water. Because easy money always makes people sloppy, massive corruption bloomed right alongside the export business. While all of this was happening, Europe's hunger problem finally started to ease up. For a short while, bird poop literally meant bread for the masses, and cities began to swell as fields no longer needed to sit empty. But the game of squeezing nutrients out of the earth took a much darker turn when guano prices started to rise. Entrepreneurs began looking for bone phosphate, and by that, they meant actual human bones. Get this, by the mid-1800s, bone merchants were raiding old graveyards and famous battlefields. After the Napoleonic Wars, scavengers dug up mass graves and hauled cartloads of remains to grind into fertilizer. British ports took in huge shiploads labeled animal bones, and everyone knew a share came from places like Waterloo. Across Europe, bones from slaughterhouses joined the stream. When yields are on the line, ethics get blurry fast. History shows us that behind our neat product labels and sanitized supply chains, people once had their hands elbow-deep in dust and human remains. When phosphorus runs short, the lines that people swear they would never cross start to get blurry very fast. Governments wrote brand new laws just to grab tiny islands, and merchants were willing to pay for graveyard dirt. You really can't separate food security from the desperate ways people bend the rules to protect it. This rush for nutrients also lit the fuse for major international wars. Guano wasn't the only thing people wanted, but fertilizer value was at the heart of every regional fight in South America. The Chincha Islands War and the later War of the Pacific pulled Peru, Bolivia, and Chile into a violent spiral over who controlled the mineral wealth of the coast. Fleets shelled ports and ironclads fought at sea, because fertility was just as important as the flags flying over the territory. Eventually, the guano windfall in Peru began to fade away. The best deposits were thinned out, and the state's fictitious prosperity finally cracked under the weight of massive debt. Guano hadn't built a real economy, but had instead funded a giant binge that left the country struggling. Farmers in Europe were now hooked on these external nutrients, so they needed a new answer when the ships finally slowed down. That pressure is what drove the rise of industrial fertilizers, starting with rock reacted with acid and leading up to the famous Haber-Bosch process. Meanwhile, the same environmental patterns we see today were already starting to show up in the water. Guano and bone ash made the fields look lush, but the runoff from those farms didn't care about anyone's financial ledgers. Streams began to turn green around treated land, and cities spread waste without ever closing the loop. The idea of recycling nutrients back to the fields got thinner as global trade grew, and we were essentially learning how to waste resources at a massive scale. Let's be honest, the lesson here is both ugly and very clear. When the nutrient that holds all of life together gets scarce or expensive, ethics go out the window and governments move with a speed you only see when stomachs are empty. The first phosphorus rush gave us booming yields, but it also gave us raided graves, forced labor, and war. It set a template that we still follow today. Grab what is easy, push the costs onto someone else, and worry about the water later. Because apparently, the rush for these minerals never really ends. It just changes its source and its dress code, moving from bird cliffs and bone mills to massive acid towers and export tenders. The waste that we choose to ignore in 1 century inevitably becomes the crisis that the next generation has to drink. The algae apocalypse, when fertilizer kills the ocean. While massive ships were busy hauling rock across the desert, rainwater was doing the exact opposite back on the farm by pulling phosphorus right off the fields and dragging it downhill. It starts in a little ditch, moves to a creek, and eventually hits a river that really doesn't care how much the farmer paid for that fertilizer. Nitrogen and phosphorus usually show up to the party together like a double shot of espresso, which makes the algae go absolutely wild until the fish can't even breathe. Here's a fun fact. The Gulf of Mexico actually has a dead zone that regularly grows larger than some entire US states. Every summer, a layer of warm water caps the surface, while the Mississippi River dumps a massive nutrient bomb from the Corn Belt right into the mix. This causes algae to bloom, die, and rot, and that decay process literally sucks the life-giving oxygen straight out of the water. Local shrimpers have to check satellite maps the same way pilots check the morning weather just to guess where the red blotches are going to pop up. Some years the dead zone is the size of Connecticut, and other years it's more like New Jersey. But either way, it's a paycheck moving right out from under your boat. 3 days before that happens in the Gulf, the same script plays out in Lake Erie. When summer nutrient loads spike and winds die down, the western basin turns into thick pea soup stretching to the horizon. Microcystis, a toxin-producing cyanobacteria, starts pumping out microcystin that can damage your liver. In 2014, Toledo shut off taps for roughly 500,000 people. Emergency alerts said don't drink it, don't boil it, don't even brush your teeth. Grocery stores became water depots with lines curling into parking lots. That's when people felt phosphorus the hard way. You might be surprised to learn that we don't actually mean to create these massive toxic blooms. Farmers are just trying to feed their crops, and they've been told for generations that missing a single dose at planting time can ruin an entire harvest. Because rain and soil conditions are so hard to predict, they often apply a little extra as a sort of insurance in a bag, just to be safe. On top of that, big livestock operations concentrate so much manure in one spot that certain counties turn bright brown on nutrient maps. These are hotspots where there is simply more phosphorus sitting on the ground than the local fields could ever possibly use. When you add in tile drains that shoot water out of the fields like high-speed veins, you've basically built a direct highway from the fertilizer bin straight to the mouth of the river. Government regulators like to call this non-point source pollution, which is really just fancy talk for it comes from everywhere, so we can't blame any one person. The point sources, like factory pipes you can actually see and photograph, have mostly been cleaned up because cities upgraded their plants and fixed their chemistry. Those were big wins for the environment, but the algae didn't seem to care because the diffuse runoff from the landscape just kept right on coming. It's a pretty awkward situation because you can easily regulate a big factory, but you can't exactly knock on every single barn door with a citation and expect to win your next election. Meanwhile, it's the cities and the taxpayers who end up stuck with the bill. Water treatment plants have to buy expensive new sensors and tons of activated carbon, which makes local budgets groan under the pressure. Tourism also takes a massive hit whenever a popular lake turns neon green and starts to reek like a swamp. Charter boat captains have to cancel their weekend trips, moms start texting each other beach warnings, and kids constantly ask why the water looks so wrong. The irony here is pretty vicious, because we spend billions of dollars mining phosphorus to grow food, and then we spend billions more just to keep that same phosphorus out of our drinking water. What nobody really understood during those early blooms was just how sticky this stuff is once it gets into the environment. In old farming regions, the soil has been soaking up phosphorus for decades, creating what scientists call legacy P. Even if every farmer slammed on the brakes today, that phosphorus bank would still leak back out into the water slow and steady for years. To make matters worse, rainstorms are getting much more intense as the climate warms up, and every heavy inch of rain acts like a pry bar under the soil's surface. The Maumee River has a very long memory, and so do the Chesapeake Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. Let's be honest, the current financial incentives are pushing everyone in the wrong direction. If you're a grower working with razor-thin profit margins, skipping a phosphorus application feels like rolling the dice with your entire livelihood. Insurance companies don't write special policies for perfect weather, and grain buyers aren't paying you a premium for responsible nutrient management. Most people choose to protect their yield, but over 1 million of those tiny individual choices eventually stack up into a giant green smear on a satellite image. But there is a little bit of hope starting to peek through the clouds. Some farm co-ops have started paying for edge-of-field water tests, and certain states are now paying growers to plant cover crops that soak up leftover nutrients. In Ohio, the H2Ohio program pushed for cost-sharing on things like buffer strips and variable-rate fertilizer zones. It's all voluntary for now, but money usually talks louder than words in the farming world. Scientists have set a target to cut phosphorus loads in Lake Erie by 40%, and while that sounds like a lot, it's not some impossible sci-fi number. We can actually get there if enough people start banding their fertilizer instead of just throwing it on the surface. Across town at the treatment plants, engineers are also finding ways to catch the stuff on the back end. A mineral called struvite tends to build up like hard concrete inside sewage pipes whenever phosphorus and magnesium meet. Utilities got tired of using jackhammers to clear the clogs, So companies like Ostara started building reactors that harvest those crystals before they cause trouble. Suddenly, a maintenance nightmare becomes a high-quality fertilizer product that can be sold. Stockholm gave it a shot, and Germany went even further by passing a law that says cities must recover phosphorus from sewage by the 2030s. Sweden set similar goals because they decided it was time to stop treating valuable nutrients like common trash. Here's where it gets really crazy. Even with all these smarter pipes and better fields, we're still losing way more phosphorus than we should. Food processing plants dump it, landfills lock it away, and back roads get covered in manure at the wrong time because the storage lagoons are full. Fixing this isn't about one single high-tech gadget, but rather the boring logistics of getting the right amount in the right place at the right time. There is one final line that nobody really likes to say out loud, and that is the fact that the ocean doesn't offer many second chances. You can fix a city budget in a year or two, but you can't just reboot a fishery that has lost its oxygen for 5 summers in a row. Shrimp don't have a vote in the legislature, and lakes don't hire expensive lobbyists to protect their interests. They just turn green, ruin everyone's July, and send a massive bill to whoever happens to live downstream. The sewage secret, mining cities for phosphorus. While farm fields are leaking nutrients one way, our cities are leaking them in a completely different direction, straight through us. Every plate of food you finish, every shower you take, and every single flush of the toilet is part of a massive nutrient conveyor belt. Did you know that the average city actually carries enough phosphorus in its wastewater to be a major player in regional farming? We usually treat it like a gross nuisance, and then we pay a fortune just to throw it away. Here's a fun fact. Wastewater plants have been fighting a villain with a surprisingly pretty name called struvite. It's a crystal that forms naturally when phosphorus, ammonia, and magnesium meet up inside the plumbing. Inside those big pipes, it grows like barnacles on the bottom of a boat, except it's much denser and harder to remove. Operators used to have to bring in jackhammers just to break the stuff off, which created a maintenance bill that was absolutely through the roof. Eventually, someone asked why we weren't growing these crystals on purpose so we could sell them back to farmers as fertilizer. It's funny because apparently, we needed our pipes to get completely clogged before we remembered that these nutrients actually have value. A company called Ostara showed up with these massive reactors that look a bit like giant stainless steel candy canes. They flow the wastewater in, seed the right conditions, and tiny pearls of struvite fall out of the bottom like uniform granules. You can bag these up and sell them as a premium slow-release fertilizer that keeps phosphorus out of the rivers while making the treatment plants run much smoother. This gives cities a brand new revenue stream instead of a constant repair bill, and you can almost hear the city accountants exhaling in relief. Stockholm tried out their own versions of this at the Henriksdal plant, and plenty of other cities have followed their lead. The biggest change didn't come from new tech, it came from law. Germany drew a hard line and told large plants they must recover phosphorus from sewage sludge by 2029. Not try your best, but a mandate that flips markets. Utilities that never thought about fertilizer are calling engineers to mine their own cities. Sweden followed with national targets to recycle a majority of phosphorus back into food systems, close the loop, protect lakes, build steady local supply. Europe is worried about dependence on Moroccan rock and cadmium limits. Suddenly, what we flush is a matter of national security. Meanwhile, something very interesting has been happening in the corporate boardrooms of big fertilizer companies. They saw the headlines and immediately started rolling out green brochures filled with circular economy, logos, and pilot partnerships. While that's helpful, you can still see the tension when those same companies lobby against stricter recovery standards. If cities start producing a huge chunk of their own phosphorus locally, it takes away some of the power from the big international mining operations. It's not a total crisis for the industry yet, but the tide is definitely starting to shift. Now, we shouldn't get too romantic about this because recovery definitely isn't free. You need a lot of upfront cash for tanks, centrifuges, and reactors, and you need skilled operators who understand both wastewater and fertilizer specs. There's also the question of who actually owns the nutrients. Is it the city, the taxpayers, or the contractor running the plant? This is usually where the big deals start to stall out. Plus, sludge politics are a very real thing, and people often freak out when they hear the word biosolids, even if the final product is a purified mineral crystal. The story in the United States is a bit different because we don't have a federal mandate, so progress has been pretty patchy. A few forward-thinking cities have installed these harvesters because the math works out once you factor in the saved maintenance costs. Most other cities are just waiting around because raising sewage rates is a touchy subject and nobody wants to pay for a benefit they can't see. While some states are offering grants to help out, America is still sending a massive amount of phosphorus to landfills where it can't do anyone any good. Here's where it gets really crazy. The math for a circular economy works best when you look at the whole map instead of just the pipes. Imagine a big city where food comes in from a ring of surrounding farms and the nutrients concentrate at the treatment plant. If you recover that phosphorus, you still have to figure out the logistics of moving it back to the fields that grew the food in the first place. That requires trucks, contracts, and perfect timing, and if you get it wrong, you've just built a different kind of waste pile. But if you get it right, you've created a steady local stream of fertilizer that protects you from price spikes overseas. Engineers are also working on ways to mine phosphorus out of the ash left over after sewage sludge is burned for energy. This process is a bit more complicated than growing crystals because you have to use chemicals to leach out the phosphorus while leaving heavy metals behind. It's a high-tech solution that lets big cities handle recovery at a massive scale while meeting strict fertilizer standards. Germany's new laws are pushing the whole industry toward this model, betting that if you make recovery mandatory, the innovation will get faster and cheaper. We also have to talk about quality because farmers are very picky about what they put on their soil. Struvite is great because it releases nutrients slowly right at the roots, but it's not very helpful if you need to fix a major soil deficiency in a single pass. Products made from sewage ash can be much more powerful, but they have to be tested constantly to make sure they don't contain any nasty contaminant. In this business, trust is everything, and one bad batch of fertilizer could ruin the entire market for everyone. The line that ties all of this back to the environmental problems in Lake Erie is simple. Every kilogram we catch at a plant is a kilogram that won't feed a toxic bloom. Our cities are basically becoming mines with gates and meters instead of open pits in the desert covered in dust. The irony is still there. We are essentially fixing a leak that we created ourselves, but now the fix pays for itself twice. We get much cleaner water for our families and a local hedge against the unpredictable global supply chain. Even with all that progress, the cold hard math says that sewage recovery won't meet the total demand for every farm in the country. It's not even close, but it does chip away at the edges and buys us some much needed time. It takes the pressure off our rivers and makes us a little less dependent on international geopolitics. Most importantly, it reminds us of a basic truth we often forget. Nutrients are stories that should always end right where they started, on a field growing food, and not in a green line of scum on a local beach. The farm fix how to grow with less. So here's the pivot. When the rocks get expensive and the lakes start turning green, the farm field has to become a laboratory. Farmers don't really have the luxury of playing with theories because they need plants that actually stand up and checks that actually clear the bank. The real fix starts with knowing exactly what you have instead of just guessing. I know soil tests sound like a total snooze fest, but they are the exact moment the fog finally lifts. If you pull your cores the right way and map out those results, you're going to learn two very important truths. You'll see that some zones are doing just fine while others are starving, which means blasting a flat rate of fertilizer across the whole place is basically just lighting your money on fire. If you band your phosphorus right near the seed, specifically 2 inches over and 2 inches down, you put the nutrients exactly where the roots can find them early on when it pays off the most. While broadcasting has its place, a tight band acts like a scalpel for your soil. Here's a fun fact. Variable rate technology isn't some futuristic dream anymore. It's just something that most people aren't using to its full potential yet. The monitor you already have sitting in your cab can tell a spreader to hold back on those high testing zones and feed the hungry spots instead. By doing this, you save on product and skip the runoff from areas that are already full. And the best part is that the plants don't care that you spent less money. They only care that the right inch of dirt got exactly what it needed to thrive. Because apparently, fields aren't actually flat in anything except our spreadsheets. Now, do you remember that legacy pea bank we talked about that sits in older soils? The real trick is figuring out how to turn a locked vault into a usable checking account. Mycorrhizal fungi are absolute pros at this. They stitch tiny white threads all through the soil to extend a plant's reach by several meters, and then they simply trade sugars for nutrients. If you inoculate in the furrow on ground that's been hammered by years of tillage, suddenly your roots have their own little runners. When you pair that with a starter band, the early stress on the plant just drops away. Cover crops help out here too, and I'm not talking about them like a fancy TED talk, but more like a lesson in physics. Planting something like rye or clover holds the soil in place while leaking carbon and setting up microbes that unlock bound phosphorus with organic acids. Keeping a living root in the ground during November makes your life in May a whole lot easier. You might be surprised to learn just how much power sits inside your crop rotations. Growing corn on corn usually requires a massive fertilizer bill to keep things moving. However, if you plant corn after a small grain with a clover under seed, you're looking at a completely different story. Deep-rooted cover crops like radish act like biological drills that create channels and scavenge for leftovers before handing them back when they rot away. In this scenario, you didn't actually have to add more phosphorus. You just moved what was already there back into reach. If you fence off a few acres and let cattle graze those covers, you can cycle nutrients right there on site instead of hauling them in a tanker from a county that's already drowning in manure. Precision isn't just about having the latest hardware, it's really about your timing. Phosphorus doesn't move very much once it's in the soil, so a heavy rain right after you broadcast is basically a bullhorn leading straight to the nearest ditch. A small shift in strategy would be to apply your nutrients when a dry window is likely and keep a living cover between the granule and the sky. If you aim for the colder months when the microbes are napping, you can band at planting and let the biology handle the slow release. Strip till methods slot the seed into warm, mellowed bands where the nutrients are tucked in safely. It's the same seed you've always used, just in a much smarter neighborhood. Let's be honest, the big fear here is yield drag. If you've been running your farm hot for years, cutting back on your rates feels like walking a tightrope without a safety net. The best way to get around that fear is to run side-by-side trials that you can actually believe in. Try taking one field and setting up 3 different rate zones where you maintain your current rate, trim it by 15%, and then trim it by 30%. While you do this, keep your bands in play and make sure you have covers ahead of your corn. If you watch the monitor and weigh the grain, you can track the actual dollars instead of just focusing on the total bushels. A lot of growers find that a 15% cut is totally invisible in the hopper, but speaks very loudly in the ledger. That 30% cut can work on high-testing soil with the right biology, but it won't work on sand that's been mined for years. At the end of the day, hard data beats vibes every single time. These little stories from across the fence lines really do matter. There was a co-op in Iowa that started lending out banding units for spring runs, and the adoption rate for the tech just jumped through the roof. Over in Michigan, a group paid for soil tests that looked at the top inch versus the top 6 inches, and the results were pretty ugly. They found that the phosphorus was stacked right in the crust where it was ready to run off, but Banding and Lighting Corporation knocked that problem down in a single year. In Kansas, a wheat grower used mycorrhizae after a hard fallow period and saw his protein levels tick up while his starter rate went down the next season. These aren't impossible moonshots. They are just consistent reps. Small farmers aren't being shut out of this progress either. A simple backpack spreader can't do variable rate applications, but you can use a bottle cap trick to move the needle. If you mark your bags and measure out bands for each row, you can plant a bit slower and hit that 2x2 placement by hand. Using community soil labs and sharing planters with banding attachments helps everyone spread out the initial cost. The return on investment is your time and a much steadier harvest, which is worth way more than a shiny map on a laptop screen. There's also a lot happening in what I call Enzyme Alley. Putting Phytase in animal feed means that pigs can pull more phosphorus out of their grain, so less of it ends up in the manure lagoons. This means the fields get exactly what the crops need instead of being hit by a tidal wave of waste. On the soil side of things, inoculants that help dissolve phosphorus can help at the margin, especially in places where the pH levels tie everything up. You should probably think of these as the spice rather than the main meal. The heavy lifting is always going to be your placement, your timing, and your rotations. The trade-offs are very real. A rye cover crop might shave 5 bushels off your yield in a cold spring unless you manage your termination perfectly. Banding takes more passes and a bit more skill, and setting up variable rate mapping costs money up front. But if you zoom out for a season or two, the math starts to flip in your favor. You'll buy less fertilizer during a price spike and deal with fewer headaches from people posting photos of green creeks on Facebook. You'll feel softer soil under your boots and see a crop that shrugs off a 3-week dry spell because the roots had some help. Here's where it gets crazy in a really good way. The same practices that allow you to cut your rates also act as armor against future price shocks. When the price of fertilizer jumps, the farm that bans and rotates their crops doesn't have to panic. They are already used to living on smart, tight doses. The guy spraying a flat rate across his whole farm is the first one who has to skip an application and just pray for the best. This is the kind of resilience that you can actually count on. Then there is the quiet win for the water. Every single pound of phosphorus that stays in the row is a pound that doesn't show up at the boat ramp in the middle of July. You didn't just protect your profit margins, you actually helped keep the local lake blue. There won't be a press release or a ribbon-cutting ceremony for it, but it's just good farming repeated field after hidden phosphorus sinks. Up until now, we've kept our eyes on the fields and the drainage pipes, but there is a whole lot of phosphorus slipping sideways where most people never look. We have to start with the chickens and the pigs. Feed mills lace their rations with extra phosphorus so the animals grow fast and their bones can keep up with the weight. All that waste turns into manure lagoons, which sounds like a nice circular system until you actually zoom in on the map. The birds are usually packed into just a county or two, but their feed comes from hundreds of miles away, and that manure can't possibly all go back to the acres that originally grew it. This creates a regional overload where phosphorus gets stacked in a few zip codes like a massive traffic jam with no exit. When the heavy rains come, a huge chunk of that stack heads straight for the nearest creek. Here's a fun fact. Adding Fides to the feed helped out by unlocking more phosphorus in the grain so that less had to be added to the rations. That was a great win, but the sheer scale of the industry eventually swamped the progress. As the barns got bigger, the mountain of manure just kept growing. Counties that used to beg for extra nutrients are now putting up "no thanks" signs because they can't absorb another tanker without breaking runoff rules and making the neighbors angry. Meanwhile, the food processors shave a little phosphorus off every chicken nugget and cheese block before sending it down the drains. Landfills end up trapping food scraps and bones where living plants will never be able to see them again. We are basically tossing out high-quality fertilizer and putting a garbage sticker on it. And what about the cities? They consolidate nutrients, but not all of that material goes through the fancy side of the plant where we can recover things like struvite. A lot of it still ends up as sludge that gets spread on whatever fields will take it, regardless of whether those fields actually need it. It's a system driven by supply rather than what the crops actually require. Unknown to most of us, there is phosphorus hiding inside our concrete and steel as well. There isn't much per ton, but when you look across a city skyline, it really starts to add up. It's in the dust captured at cement plants, the additives in boilers, and even the flame retardants used in building materials. These are just drips and drabs, but nothing ever truly leaves the global ledger. The phosphorus just moves from being something edible to being entombed in a wall. And then we have the chips. I'm not talking about the salty kind you eat, but the silicon kind in your phone. The tech industry uses phosphorus compounds as dopants and etchants. While the volumes are tiny, the purity has to be incredibly high. Electronics don't drink fertilizer by the shipload, but they do demand clean chemicals that pull from the same upstream supply lines. In a supply crunch, the chemical plants are going to follow the highest margin. If food-grade acid pays one price and electronics pay a higher one, you can guess who wins the slot at the purifier. Now the elephant in the room, the battery pack. LFP batteries, lithium iron phosphate, went from niche to mainstream because they're safer and cheaper for EVs. Every cathode needs purified phosphoric acid, not the same form you de-drop on a field, but upstream it's the same tree. Scaling LFP needs new tech-grade acid plants. In a perfect world, that's extra capacity with its own mines. In the real world, factories ramp faster than mine. For years, fertilizer and batteries share the same suppliers, rail cars and docks. Here's where it gets crazy. By the 2030s, EV growth could pull a phosphorus stream on the order of what a mid-sized country uses for fertilizer. Not because each car is huge, but because millions of packs add up. Battery factories don't pause for monsoons or harvest windows. They run flat out on penalty contracts. Food production loses those arm wrestles more often than you think. Remember that Morocco's big advantage is their high-grade ore and their integrated plants. That makes them the natural supplier for both the fertilizer world and the tech-grade acid world. China is already a giant in the battery world, and they control a huge part of that cathode chain. If China decides to tighten their fertilizer exports to keep prices low at home, while keeping the acid flowing to batteries to hit their EV goals, the importers are going to feel the squeeze. It isn't some cartoon villain move. It's just policy math happening under two different ministries that don't share a single budget. There's a way to fix this. If we are going to lock all this phosphorus into batteries, we can at least plan for how to recover it at the end of its life. Unlike agricultural runoff, these battery packs show up at a dock with a manifest that tells us exactly what's inside. If we design them for recycling, we could pull that phosphorus back out just like we are starting to do with lithium and nickel. However, that loop isn't built at scale yet, and the first generation of packs will hit the shredders before we have the recovery lines ready. We are running late once again. Let's be honest, none of these hidden sinks are actually evil. The chickens feed people, the factories create jobs, and the electric vehicles help clean the air. The real problem is that we have a massive flow of nutrients without any maps to guide them. If we don't track where the phosphorus enters the system and where it leaks out, we're going to wake up to a very weird shortage. We'll have plants starving in the fields while warehouses and landfills sit on piles of material they can't use. The fix is actually pretty dull. It's audits, rules for manure, and recycling plans that are baked in right now. Because apparently the story of phosphorus isn't just about farms and rivers, it's about concrete, chips, and chickens all tugging at the same fragile thread. Price spikes and panic when fertilizer breaks food, while things like chickens, microchips, and phone batteries all pull at the global supply chain. Price is the one lever that every single person on Earth actually feels. If you ever look at a chart of phosphate prices, it doesn't look like a normal business graph. It looks more like a seismograph during a massive earthquake. The first big shakeup that most people still remember happened back in 2008. Oil prices spiked through the roof, shipping costs blew up overnight, and fertilizer prices went absolutely vertical. DAP that used to cost $400 a ton suddenly shot past $1,000, leaving farmers everywhere staring at their bank accounts in total shock. Farmers didn't just take it on the chin, they froze their purchases and tried to find ways around the cost. Some decided to skip a round of fertilizer entirely, just praying that the leftover phosphorus in the soil from previous years would be enough to carry the crop through. This wasn't just a problem for spreadsheets or bank ledgers, because real-world consequences followed fast. Red lines started forming in cities, and food riots broke out in countries that were already living on the edge. Governments tried to fix it by capping prices or burning through their emergency reserves while blaming greedy speculators. But the math was actually very simple. When fertilizer prices jump, crop yields sag a few months later, and fear always fills that gap first. You have to remember that the 2008 crisis didn't just pop up out of nowhere or happen in a vacuum. Global demand for better food was rising, diets were shifting toward more meat, and grain stocks were already dangerously thin. When you add a sudden shock to a system that's already stretched tight, you get a nasty chain reaction that hits everyone. Countries that depend on imports felt the sting the worst as tender deadlines passed by with zero bids from suppliers. Ships full of cargo were actually diverted in the middle of the ocean because someone else offered a better price. You could hear the pure panic in local co-op offices as people wondered if the next barge was even going to show up. That is exactly when government ministers started making desperate calls to places like Casablanca and Beijing. They weren't calling because they liked the weather. They called because OCP and Chinese suppliers were the only ones who could actually move enough tonnage to save them. That leverage we talked about earlier in the desert started ringing like a loud bell. If we fast forward to the 2021-2022 season, we see different causes, but the exact same stomach punch to the global economy. Natural gas prices in Europe went absolutely nuts, which is a huge deal because gas is what drives ammonia production. Since ammonia is the backbone of the whole fertilizer complex, including phosphates, the energy crisis bled into everything else. China decided to throttle its phosphate exports to keep its own domestic prices cool, which left the rest of the world scrambling. On top of that, sanctions and war messed up the Black Sea shipping routes and sent freight costs soaring. Some plants just idled their machines while others stayed open but had to ration what they produced. DAP and MAP prices soared again, and this time the shock hit farmers who were already bruised from pandemic chaos and record drought. Talk about some seriously bad timing. Here's a fun fact: when fertilizer prices spike, farmers don't just eat the cost. They pivot overnight: cheaper blends, lower rates, delayed top dress. Some gamble with only a little starter and hope the soil bank covers the rest. Others slash phosphorus to protect nitrogen. Fields look fine from the road till August, then ears and pods don't fill. A 5% national yield hit sounds small on paper. It's loud at the checkout. Grocery inflation doesn't wait around for the actual harvest to happen before it starts hitting your wallet. Futures markets jump immediately, and feed costs for animals start climbing right along with them. Livestock producers have to pay way more for rations, so the price of eggs, chicken, and pork starts edging up at the store. Millers and bakers have to hedge their bets at higher prices, and transport companies add fuel surcharges because diesel is expensive too. Most households end up feeling cornered by a dozen of these small price cuts to their budget. Political heat starts rising as a result, and subsidies balloon in places like India just to keep fertilizer somewhat affordable. Small farmers simply can't float a whole season of sticker shock on their own. Importers who used to shop for deals on the spot market suddenly start begging for long-term contracts, and you can probably guess who gets to write the terms for those deals. It's the handful of producers who actually have the scale to deliver. Meanwhile, the financial world leans into the chaos to see where they can make a buck. Traders keep a close eye on these tight markets and start placing big bets on where prices will go next. Export controls start popping up everywhere as countries get nervous about their own food supply. If one country blinks and caps its shipments to keep local prices down, the neighboring country usually overreacts to secure its own supply, which makes the whole market tight even more. It is a classic case of but therefore chaos where every action makes the next problem worse. In the US, companies like Mosaic push for tariffs on certain imports, which causes prices inside that tariff wall to behave differently than the rest of the world. Lawsuits start flying and people in the farm belt start grumbling, but most people find it boring until it finally ruins their profit margin. Down on the ground, you see all these tiny micro-stories that never actually make it to the front page of the news. A grain elevator in Kansas might extend a line of credit so a grower can buy at least half of his usual DAP. They do this because the harvest checks are still months away and the local banks are acting way too skittish to lend money. Over in Brazil, a soybean farmer might switch to a lower phosphorus starter and bet his whole season on biological additives to stretch out what he has. In Egypt, a massive flour mill might have to change its secret blends because their usual shipments started wobbling. Even a market vendor in Lagos might shrink the size of her bags while smiling at customers like nothing happened. Every single one of those moments traces back to a single line on a fertilizer invoice. What nobody really knew at the start of the 2021 price spike was just how long the pain was going to last. Farmers actually hate uncertainty even more than they hate high prices because you can at least plan for a high cost. If the market is whipsawing up and down, you feel like you're just gambling with the seeds you put in the ground. Some people locked in their orders at the very top of the market and got burned when prices slid 6 months later. Others waited for a better deal and missed their planting window entirely. That is why all the resilience work we see in the fields matters so much lately. Things like banding fertilizer, better soil tests, and cover crops help reduce a farmer's exposure to these crazy market swings. You still need the phosphorus to grow the food, but you can use less of it and place it much smarter to soften the blow. Let's be honest here, people always look for a villain to blame when their dinner gets too expensive. You hear words like greedflation, cartels, and speculators thrown around a lot in the media. And yeah, there is definitely some real market power happening behind the scenes. When only a few companies and a few countries control all the high-grade ore and the plants that process it, they get to shape the terms for everyone else. But you also have to deal with the cold reality of geology, energy costs, and the weather grinding away at the system. The fact that we are hitting a peak in high-grade supply doesn't get shouted about on the news, but it shows up as stubbornly high price floors and much sharper peaks. The geopolitics of this whole situation get weird incredibly fast when you look at the players involved. You have China trying to balance its domestic prices against the money it makes from exports. Morocco is busy courting India with joint ventures and soil mapping programs while trying to ignore criticism over the Western Sahara. The US is swinging tariffs around like a heavy hammer, even though its own high-grade reserves are getting pretty old. Even the EU is stuck between its strict rules on cadmium and its desperate need for food security. Right in the middle of all this are the farmers who just want to know if they can afford to feed their soil and still make their land payments at the end of the month. Here is the real tell. Whenever fertilizer issues start breaking the food system, governments start acting like there is a massive fire. They raid their national budgets, cap prices by force, ban exports, and hold big press conferences to look busy. But the smarter leaders are also starting to make long-term moves that actually matter. They are supporting precision agriculture, mandating phosphorus recovery in big cities, and diversifying who they buy from so they aren't stuck with one partner. They are building buffers that are more than just piles of bags in a warehouse. Because apparently, if you only spend your time fighting the flames, you are never going to fix the faulty wiring that started the fire. Everything is about to change as soon as world leaders stop treating phosphorus like a random commodity blip. They are starting to realize it is actually the fuel for their own political legitimacy. That is exactly where the next chapter of this story is heading. Power plays, countries betting on food security. While the traders were busy watching their price charts, governments around the world started counting up their potential votes. Food security isn't just some fancy slogan for a brochure. It is a direct performance review for anyone in power. So they started making moves. You have to start with India to see how this works on a massive scale. Every single season, millions of small farmers line up to get their subsidized fertilizer so they can plant their crops. If the government misses a tender or lets the prices spike too high, they don't just get a few angry phone calls. They get front-page headlines and lose their seats in the next election. Because of that, New Delhi built a specific playbook to keep things stable. They lock in long-term deals, use multiple different ports, and keep a direct hotline open to Casablanca. OCP leaned into this relationship by creating joint ventures and custom fertilizer blends specifically for Indian soils. They even talked about mapping out every field so each state gets the exact mix it needs. The politics here are very simple. If the DAP is there, the crops grow, and the massive subsidy bill is still way cheaper than dealing with national unrest. If the DAP isn't there, all that monsoon optimism turns into protest signs by October. I mean, seriously, nobody has ever won an election by campaigning against a bunch of brown, dying rice paddies. Meanwhile, China is playing a completely different game because they actually have the resources to do it. They mine the rock, they manufacture the chemicals, and they have a lot of hungry mouths to feed at home. When global prices start running hot, Beijing just tightens up its phosphate exports and calls it market stability. While the domestic buyers in China breathe a sigh of relief, the rest of the world's importers start groaning. Fertilizer ships that were supposed to go to Southeast Asia or Latin America suddenly never leave the dock. The message they are sending isn't subtle at all. China treats fertilizer like a strategic fuel for their country. And if you are busy building LFP battery lines, you make sure the high-purity phosphoric acid keeps flowing to those plants, even if it means less fertilizer for everyone else. It's two different government ministries, but there is only one winner: the policy goals at home. In the US, the whole fight is usually wearing a legal suit in a courtroom. Farmers want the cheapest imports they can get, but the domestic producers want a level playing field to compete. Mosaic argued a while back that certain imports were undercutting their prices, which led to a round of tariffs. Prices inside that trade wall started moving differently than the rest of the world, and the lawsuits started flying immediately. Farm groups were split right down the middle, with some people cheering for the protection while others were fuming about the higher costs. When you add energy shocks and plant outages to the mix, you get a messy stew where state officials are holding emergency calls while co-ops struggle to manage their credit lines. The real irony is that America has some of the best agronomy and precision tools in the world, but its high-grade phosphate is limited and getting older every day. Policy tries to fill that gap with bandages like tariffs today and conservation money tomorrow. Now let's zoom over to Brussels to see how the EU is handling things. They are basically sitting on two different stools at the same time. They want clean water and they want secure food. Their strict limits on cadmium in phosphates are great for protecting health, but it really thins out the list of people they can buy from. Recovery mandates like the ones in Germany are helping to build a local loop for nutrients. But in the near term, Europe still needs to import rock and acid. This leads to a lot of quiet diplomacy with Morocco that is often offset by very loud public concerns over human rights in the Western Sahara. You have one committee writing angry letters about conflict phosphate, while another committee is busy mapping out fertilizer corridors so the spring planting doesn't fail. It is a constant balancing act to keep the lakes blue, the fields green, and the voters calm. Africa is where you find the biggest gamble of all. The yields on many small farms there are incredibly low, but it isn't because the farmers lack skill. It's because they lack the right inputs and enough carbon in their soil. Leaders across the continent talk about Africa feeding itself, and that goal requires a lot more fertilizer. OCP has been courting the continent by building soil labs, offering training, and selling products in smaller, more affordable bags. It is a very smart and strategic move, but the risk to the water supply is very real. If subsidies start pouring in without any guardrails, like soil tests or rules on where to put the fertilizer, the rivers are going to turn green and public trust will erode. The prize is massive: healthier soils, steadier harvests, and less dependence on other countries. The only risk is that they might copy the mistakes of rich countries, but at a much faster speed. Meanwhile, somewhere between the big political speeches and the complex supply chains, you find the micro-stories that show how power actually moves. You might have a minister in Dhaka begging for an extension on a shipment that got stuck behind an export curb, or a West African agronomist training a local co-op on how to ban their fertilizer so they can use half the usual amount and still get a good crop. Maybe a Polish mill has to pause its work because a barge on the river didn't clear customs in time. None of these things are going to make the nightly news, but every single one of them is a stitch in the fabric that keeps bread on our plates. What nobody ever wants to say into a live microphone is that subsidies can actually become a trap. Once you promise a farmer cheap fertilizer forever, trying to change that system is like touching political napalm. If you try to link that financial aid to soil tests or better placement, someone is going to accuse you of trying to starve the farmers. But if you don't link it to anything, you are just pouring public money into water runoff and waste. The way out of this mess is actually pretty boring and slow. It involves targeted support for precision tools, guaranteed credit for specialized gear, and bonuses for farmers who can prove they reduced the nutrient load in the rivers. We need to start paying for actual outcomes instead of just how many bags of chemicals were moved. Geopolitics always adds its own, but therefore, logic to the situation. Countries might lock in long contracts with Morocco, but therefore they tie their entire future to a single shipping corridor. They might court China for some quick relief on the spot market, but therefore they risk a sudden throttle on exports when things get tight. They might slap tariffs on imports to protect their own plants, but therefore they squeeze their own farmers during a price spike. They set green rules to clean up the water, but therefore they have to pay more for specialized imports. The only real way to protect yourself is to have many small hedges. That means recovery at home, smarter use on the farm, diverse import lanes, and even small shifts in our diets to bend the demand. Here is a fun fact that nobody ever frames as being fun. The cheapest ton of phosphorus in the world is the one you didn't waste. The governments that finally understand that truth and put it into their budgets are going to win twice. They get smaller subsidy bills and they get much clearer lakes. Germany's mandate on nutrient recovery, Sweden's new targets, and India's push for soil health cards are all pieces of the same quiet policy. They are finally starting to treat phosphorus like it is oil and water combined into one. Because apparently, in a century where the weather is constantly whiplashing and politics are running hot, the country that can keep its soil fed without choking its rivers is going to win something much bigger than an election. The lab Gambit is going to win time, biotech, and long shots. So here we are, staring at the wall geology built and asking science to knock a door through it. Can we swap phosphorus for something else? The short answer is no, because there is simply no stand-in for the P in your ATP or the backbone of your DNA. You can tweak how efficiently life uses the stuff, but you can't just take it out and expect plants to keep sprinting, and that is our absolute hard limit. Because apparently, when you can't change the parts list, you have to change how the machine runs. Breeders started chasing root traits that hunt for nutrients better, and some corn lines now ooze organic acids that pry phosphorus off soil particles. Wheat with longer root hairs pulls more from tight clays, and while it's not exactly sexy, a few % gain in uptake season after season is like getting a free ton on a ship you didn't have to book. marker-assisted breeding speeds that work up while gene editing sharpens it. So you aren't really inventing new biology as much as you're cheating the odds in the plant's favor. Microbes jumped from the fringe to the front row lately. In the soil, certain bacteria and fungi leak acids and enzymes that nudge bound phosphorus into a solution, and when you pair them with a starter band, you basically give the roots a butler and a map. Trials are still a bit mixed, with big wins on some soils shrinking to a total meh, where the pH or calcium shut the door, but the direction is definitely right. And in the barns, putting Fidace in feed turned into a quiet revolution because pigs and chickens now get more phosphorus out of their grain. This means their rations carry less added mineral and the manure mountain is a little less loaded, which is a tiny tweak with a huge throughput. Here's where it gets crazy. People are actually trying to teach crops to ask for less, not by starving them, but by changing their internal signaling so they don't overbuild structures when the phosphorus is tight. Stress-responsive promoters and nudges in internal recycling allow plants to cannibalize their old leaves a lot smarter than they used to. It won't turn a pile of sand into Iowa, but it can shave the top off a fertilizer bill without shaving down the yield. And that is the only number growers actually salute. Meanwhile, miners and chemists are squeezing the rock we used to ignore. Low-grade ore with ugly impurities can be upgraded now that beneficiation plants can float, crush, and separate the material to spit out a cleaner concentrate. Energy costs go up and water use goes up while the waste stacks grow. But if the high-grade stuff stays tight and prices keep a floor, these lines finally start to pencil out. You also see acid plants tweaking their flows to strip out cadmium and heavy metals, so the product clears those strict EU rules, which is basically just chemistry acting as passport control. Then there's the siren song of the sea. Phosphorus swims in the ocean and the sediments down there hang on to a lot more, but thermodynamics says good luck trying to pull it out. Concentrations are low and separations are energy hungry, plus stirring up those sediments can wake up things you really don't want in your fishing net. Lab papers imagine membranes and selective resins, while pilot rigs blink to life near outfalls where concentrations spike, which is basically just fancy wastewater mining. The open ocean is just a billion straws in a milkshake you can't ever finish. What nobody says at conferences loud enough is that energy is the shadow currency of phosphorus. If natural gas gets expensive, every acid plant blinks, but if power is cheap and clean, then tougher recovery methods start to look a lot better. That's why some long shots are tied directly to the grid, like plasma tricks or electrochemical leaching of ash, and there are even wild ideas to reduce elemental phosphorus for closed-loop route. It's cool science, but the economics are incredibly hard to justify. Now remember those LFP batteries from earlier. Tech-grade phosphoric acid has to be very clean, and building that capacity without raiding the fertilizer lines is a manufacturing problem that labs can actually help with. New purifiers and smarter precipitation steps allow for modular plants near the mines, and the payoff is having 2 lanes on the highway where one is for food and one is for tech. At the end of a battery's life, recyclers can theoretically grab that phosphorus back from the cathodes, so that isn't just research anymore. It's engineering on a deadline. Mining waste is a total sleeper. Old tailings hold phosphorus we walked right past decades ago, but remining them with better flotation agents and process control turns that old trash into new feed. It also cleans up a massive mess, which is why communities like that part and investors like that it's already near the rails and roads. Regulators love that it reduces the need for new holes in the ground, even if everyone hates that the progress is slower than a news headline. Did you know plants already hoard phosphorus internally and shuffle it around like a family budget? Biotech wants to make that thrift even sharper by pumping more into the seeds without shorting the strength of the stalk. They want to keep leaves efficient for longer on a short supply and help the plant recover faster after cold snaps that usually stall uptake. Each of these is a 0.5% here or a 2% gain there, but if you stack enough of them, you've actually built a successful season. Let's be honest, there's plenty of snake oil in this space. You'll see a jug that promises miracles or a microbe that supposedly fixes every soil, but farmers have heard it all before and their filter is brutal. They want to see replicated trials and independent data over multiple years, because if it doesn't show up on a weigh wagon or in the checkbook, it's just a story and not a real solution. So the lab Gambit isn't one single moonshot. It's 100 small wins that eventually add up. We get better roots, smarter bugs, and thriftier plants alongside cleaner ore and tougher recovery rules that create new markets. There is no substitute for phosphorus, but we are building a toolbox that makes each kilogram do more work while leaking less. That buys us time to build city-to-field loops and ease the pressure on the desert conveyor. And in a fight where the atoms won't budge, time is the closest thing we have to a breakthrough. Eat the change, diet shifts, and phosphate demand. So far, we've squeezed the rock, the pipes, and the fields. There's one lever left that doesn't need a new mine or a government mandate, and that's simply what we choose to eat. Did you know a steak is basically a nutrient pyramid flipped upside down? You pour phosphorus into corn and soy to feed it to a cow that keeps most of it for its own bones, and then you only get a tiny slice of protein back. It's delicious, sure, but it isn't exactly efficient. Here's a fun fact. Chickens and pigs beat cows on feed conversion, but all animal protein multiplies phosphorus demand compared to just eating plants. Grain-to-meat roots lose a little bit at every single step, from manure spills to processing offcuts, until the ledger shows way more phosphorus was used than humans actually ate. If you shift a few meals a week from red meat to poultry or beans, the whole system starts to breathe, and that isn't a fad diet. It's just physics at the dinner table. Now remember that plate of simple food at the gas station. Ultra-processed stuff hides phosphorus too because manufacturers absolutely love using phosphate additives. They keep the cheese gooey, the meat pink, and the soda fizzy. You might be surprised to learn these additives spike our intake far above what whole foods would give us, and the kicker is that they are hyper-available to our body. They are great for texture but tough on your kidneys, and they stay invisible at checkout because the labels bury them in the small print. Because apparently, we turned a critical farm nutrient into a way to extend shelf life. Talk about waste, literally. We buy way more than we actually eat between the fridge science projects and the buffet trays that get scraped into the bins. Landfills then lock that phosphorus underground in a nasty stew of methane and regrets, but composting can flip that script. If we separate the organics and collect them clean, we can run them through digesters that turn scraps into energy and nutrient-rich solids. Cities that do this right push those nutrients back to local farms. And while it's not glamorous, it's a much better ending for last week's salad. You can feel the cultural pushback already. Food is identity, and if you tell people what not to eat, they usually just dig in their heels. So the smarter move is to nudge people instead of nagging them, and price signals can really help with that. If subsidies stop hiding the real cost of resource-heavy food, the choices will tilt on their own. We could have school lunches that swap in pulses a couple days, a week, or grocery, and caps that feature actual meals built around grains instead of sad diet aisles. Here's where it gets crazy. Small shifts at scale can actually bend the national phosphorus demand. A city that cuts red meat purchases for its institutions by 20% while composting everything can shave thousands of tons of phosphorus use across its supply web. That buffer's fertilizer spikes far away from the cafeteria, and even though it sounds soft to talk about menus and bins, it's leverage that doesn't require a desert conveyor. There's a micro-story about a hospital system in the Midwest that stopped buying meats with phosphate injection. They didn't do it for the phosphorus, they did it for patient sodium levels. Their distributor had to scramble to find better suppliers, and the side effect was that less additive phosphorus flowed through every tray and drain in the building. If you multiply that by school districts and corporate campuses, the numbers stop being cute and start being massive. Meanwhile, home cooks can dodge these additives with some pretty simple swaps. You can buy real cheese instead of cheese product, or choose unbrined meats and pick dry beans over instant meals a few nights a week. There's no need for a lecture when these are just habits that your budget likes and your wastewater plant will thank you for. And if your city offers green bins, you should use them. And if they don't, you should push for them because that's a policy ask you can make between errands. Let's be honest, none of this is going to fix the underlying geology. Morocco doesn't really care what you had for lunch today, but diet shifts slow the treadmill down so that less animal feed means less phosphorus has to be mined and shipped. Fewer additives means less high-purity acid gets diverted to food factories, and less waste in the landfill means more goes back to the fields that fed you in the first place. Each of these is a small valve that turns a torrent into a flow we can actually manage. There's a justice angle to this too. Low-income neighborhoods often get hammered by food deserts where ultra-processed options are the only thing available. For many people, a diet heavy in phosphate additives isn't a choice. It's just what's there on the shelf. Policy can change that by funding fresh food co-ops and community compost programs that return nutrients to local gardens. You can shift phosphorus and public health in the exact same move. Because apparently, the cheapest kilogram of phosphorus is still the one you never had to mine in the first place. And the easiest place to save it might just be on your next grocery list. The cover-up, PR, lobbying, and the comfortable lie. While farmers were busy arguing over shipping rates and government ministers were chasing down new tenders, a very different kind of machine was humming away in corporate boardrooms. I'm talking about the message mill. Industry statements always sounded so calm and soothing, didn't they? You've heard the hits before. There are plenty of reserves, or it's just a temporary logistics issue. And my personal favorite, prices are only high for now. Honestly, we see this in every sector, because apparently, if you just rename a massive crisis as a transportation hiccup, you don't have to talk about the scary stuff like geology or power. Here's a fun fact for you. Reserves isn't actually a fixed number, but more like a sliding door that moves whenever it's convenient. When prices jump up or some new technology improves, stuff that used to be labeled as resources suddenly gets promoted to reserves with the stroke of a pen. So, when you see a cheerful chart showing that the supply is growing every few years, it doesn't mean new rocks magically appeared out of thin air. It just means someone updated their assumptions to make the math look better. It's useful for the books, sure, but in a press release, that kind of nuance just turns into comfort food for the public. Investors relax, editors move on to the next story, and the farmers are left staring at their massive invoices. What nobody outside of the people making the spreadsheets ever catches is the little trick hidden inside the pie chart. High-grade rock is the clean stuff that needs less acid to process and doesn't have as many heavy metals, but that specific supply is shrinking way faster than the total tonnage. So when a company says we have centuries of phosphate left, they might be technically telling the truth if they're counting every bit of dust and low-grade seam in the ground. Meanwhile, the part that actually keeps your fertilizer affordable and clean is tightening up every single day. The lie isn't necessarily the number itself, but the way they frame the whole picture. Think tanks and white papers are the ones who help set that frame for the public. Some of these reports are rock solid and skeptical in the best way possible, but others lean on funding that conveniently steers the spotlight away from the problems. A report might downplay the idea of peak phosphorus by calling it a total myth, and before you know it, that headline is being quoted everywhere. Meanwhile, if you dig 3 levels deep into the appendix, the authors finally admit that our dependence on high-grade rock is a massive pinch point. The executive summary becomes the only story people read, while the scary caveats never actually leave the PDF. Lobbying is where the industry really adds some muscle to the message. In one hallway, you'll see companies pledging to start circular pilots with glossy photos of recycled nutrient pearls and partnerships with smiling mayors. We definitely need those projects, don't get me wrong, but down another hallway, those same people are arguing against hard mandates like the ones in Germany. They claim it's too fast or too expensive and insist we should just let the market evolve on its own. When people ask for stricter standards on cadmium or transparency on ore grades, the response is always that it's commercially sensitive. You can almost hear the strategy. They want to be seen leading the way, as long as they're never actually forced to lead. Media fatigue usually does the rest of the work for them. Let's be honest, phosphorus just isn't very sexy compared to melting ice caps or a hurricane on live TV. It's a boring story about charts, pipes, and dirt, which makes it way too easy to flatten into a shrug by saying scientists disagree. So when a price spike hits and people start asking if we're running out, a roster of experts will say, no, not really. And they're right in a very narrow, annoying way. We aren't going to hit zero tomorrow, but the real answer is that the best stuff is getting tighter and the supply is concentrated under just a few flags. Unfortunately, that complicated truth usually dies on the editing floor. Meanwhile, those reserve numbers just become pieces in a giant game of chess. Companies will list huge resources to look stable, then highlight a smaller reserves figure that still looks big enough to keep people from panicking. Analysts who try to push for a breakdown of the actual ore quality are usually told that it's just technical noise that doesn't matter. But here's the thing, grade is destiny. High-cadmium rock is a massive headache for the EU, and low-grade ore eats up way more acid and power to process. None of that shows up on a cheery slide at a shareholder meeting because the comfortable lie lives in choosing quantity over quality. Did you know some of the greenest sounding moves are just shields for the status quo? A city pilot might recover a few hundred tons a year, great press, tiny dent. That same year, lobbying waters down a regional rule that would have forced thousands of tons across dozens of plants. Headlines celebrate, the ledger barely twitches. Optics 1, outcomes 0. Across the water, the fight over Western Sahara has turned into a total PR thicket. Labels like conflict phosphate trigger boycotts and divestments, while ethics councils issue stern letters to the big players. The industry counters this by talking about community programs, job figures, and complicated legalese about territorial status. Each side just picks the facts that help their case. Ship trackers post the names of vessels carrying the ore, while corporate sites post their latest sustainability scores. The average person can't figure out international sovereignty at a glance, so their attention moves on and the conveyor belt keeps running. And then we have the comfort phrases like circular economy or responsible sourcing. Those are all good words, but you have to watch what happens when someone proposes a measurement that actually has teeth. If you suggest mandatory phosphorus recovery from sewage sludge, they'll say it's too prescriptive. If you want binding runoff limits with real enforcement, they'll say it's unfair to farmers. Even asking for full disclosure of where the ore comes from is labeled as competitive harm. The gap between the brochure and the actual law is exactly where the cover-up breathes. Let's be honest, this isn't some cartoon conspiracy with villains in a dark room. It's just about incentives. If your profit margins depend on selling more tons into a leaky system, you aren't going to race to fix the leaks that would shrink your own market. If your biggest political risk is tied to a disputed mine, you're going to fund narratives that make that dispute feel like it's a million miles away. If your investors love growth, you're going to choose words that soothe their fears. Everyone is being perfectly rational, and the planet gets algae blooms as a result. I heard a story about a Midwestern utility that pitched a new recovery plant. The ratepayers were going to save money on maintenance, the rivers would be cleaner, and local farms could finally buy a recycled product. Industry reps praised the idea at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, but then they pushed quietly at the State House to keep those recovery rules strictly voluntary. The plant eventually turned on, but the statewide impact never actually happened. Because apparently, pilots are cheap to fund, but mandates are the only things that actually move markets. Here's the twist the PR teams never mention. The real scandal is the waste, not the scarcity. The lie tells you not to worry because there's plenty of rock left, but the truth is that we're throwing away the very stuff we already spent money to mine. If we fixed that one problem, geopolitics would matter less and price spikes wouldn't hurt nearly as much. But making that fix threatens someone's sales line and someone else's favorite talking point. This is the moment where everything has to change, and it starts when we stop buying the comfortable lie and start asking for receipts. I don't want slogans, I want to see the actual numbers. How much phosphorus did you recover per person this year? What's the cadmium level in those imports? How many fields actually used precision placement this spring? If the answers feel slippery, I promise you it's not an accident. The loop we opened earlier is still hanging, and real change has a specific shape. Policy with teeth, markets that pay for outcomes, a culture that treats nutrients like lifeblood. Now let's count down what that looks like when you draw the line to 2050. The countdown, scenarios to 2050. If you stand on a quiet farm road at dawn in the year 2050, you'll be able to feel exactly which path we decided to take. The air will tell you the story, and the water will too. So let's run through the tapes that we still have time to edit. We'll start with the baseline. This is what happens if we just keep doing what we're doing right now with a few pilots and some precision tech, but mostly sticking to the status quo. Demand continues to climb as the population grows and diets get richer, which means high-grade rock gets even tighter. Prices start swinging like a gate in a windstorm. Every few years, a massive price spike blows a hole in national budgets, leaving importers to scramble while exporters flex their muscle. Farmers have to trim their application rates, which makes yields wobble and grocery bills bruise the average family. Dead zones in the ocean shrink a little after a few loud summers, but then they grow right back because legacy phosphorus leaks on its own schedule. It's not a total collapse, but it's a constant, painful grind that the poor feel first. Now let's look at a managed descent. In this version, we treat phosphorus like it's both a fuel and a pollutant at the same time. Mandates like the ones in Germany push for recovery from sewage and ash across all the wealthy countries until it becomes as normal as taking the trash out. Cities sign long-term contracts with farm co-ops so that nutrients can ride on trucks back to the very soils that fed the people in the first place. Soil testing stops being just a suggestion and becomes the actual ticket to getting government subsidies. Banding fertilizer right where the plant needs it beats broadcasting it across the field by habit, not just hype. Cover crops start to stitch more acres together, and things like mycorrhizae and enzymes become standard tools rather than expensive magic. Diets even bend a little toward poultry and pulses, and processors cut out those extra phosphate additives because buyers are finally asking questions. Prices still jump occasionally, but the peaks are smaller and the floors are predictable. The water finally gets a breather, and honestly, the whole thing is kind of boring, which is exactly what victory looks like. The hard landing is the scenario that nobody wants to say out loud. Imagine a massive drought hits the grain belts at the exact same time a price spike lands. China decides to throttle its exports to keep its own markets cool, or maybe a mine outage in a key corridor chokes the entire supply chain. Importers start tossing up export bans on their own grains to shield local prices, and fertilizer ships start rerouting in the middle of the ocean again. Farmers slash their phosphorus use in a panic right when they need it most, only to realize the soil bank isn't there to save them. Yields fall in the areas that can't absorb the hit, and food inflation turns into actual rationing in a few cities. Unrest starts to bloom in places where kitchens were already tight, and the lakes don't get a break because flood years rip all that legacy phosphorus loose. The story stops being about charts and starts being about curfews. But there is a wild card. It's not some miracle ore we haven't found yet, but a total breakthrough in how we handle recovery economics and policy. Imagine if ash mining plants matured so fast and became so cheap that regions started mandating recycled content the same way they did for paper decades ago. Utilities would stop arguing about who owns the waste because the law would clearly state that the city owns the nutrient and the contractor just gets a cut. We could have a fast, international standard for cadmium so that products move across borders without becoming a customs nightmare. Then you layer on some smart software with national nutrient maps that match the supply to the fields every week instead of once a year. It's mostly just plumbing and spreadsheets, but it changes the flow of nutrients the same way shipping containers change the entire world economy. Meanwhile, regular households and schools can grab the levers that feed back into every single one of these scenarios. You can separate your organics, compost at scale, and start buying unbrined meats that skip the phosphate pump processing. You can nudge the menus at your local institutions and fund the green bins that make treatment upgrades possible. It sounds tiny until you realize that a million tiny choices are what actually tilt the demand and stop the leaked ton. These little micro-stories eventually become the architecture of a new system. I can see a Midwestern river hitting its 40% pollution cut because 3 counties finally paid for the right banding gear, and the local co-op refused to spread manure on fields that were already saturated. A coastal city could write a tender requiring 10% recycled phosphorus for all its public landscaping, which would create a massive buyer overnight. An EV firm might even fund a phosphoric acid line at a mine just to make sure their battery supply is walled off from the swings in the food market. A national health system could ban certain additives for the sake of patient outcomes, and the supply chain would clean up its labels faster than any law could ever force them to. Each one of these is just a switch on the same giant circuit. What nobody wants to admit is how much of this comes down to governance rather than just fancy gadgets. If you kill the perverse incentives and stop paying people for how many tons they move, and instead start paying for the runoff we don't see, the industry will race toward the finish line we need. If you keep hiding the waste behind soft words and PR, you're just locking in that painful baseline scenario. The countdown isn't a clock ticking down on a mine in the desert. It's a calendar marking whether we can build these loops before the next price spike asks us how serious we really were. So stand on that farm road one more time. In a managed descent, the ditch next to you runs clear even after a storm that used to smear the whole landscape green. The co-op yard has pallets of recycled struvite sitting right next to the traditional stuff, and nobody even blinks at it. The price board is still high enough to matter, but the numbers don't feel like a threat to your survival. In the hard landing, that same ditch smells like July in the middle of May, and a farmer is left staring at a bill that reads like a dare. At the end of the day, we're the ones who choose which air we're going to breathe. The real lie wasn't that we were running out of phosphorus, but that we were told wasting it was just a normal part of life. We treated it like someone else's problem because it felt cheaper to let it leak than to actually fix the system. If this story hit home, you should subscribe and check out our deep dive on how fertilizer prices are literally sparking protests and wars right now. You can help by sharing this video to push your own city toward composting and wastewater recovery, or even just by asking your grocer about phosphate additives. If you farm or live in a farming community, start backing soil tests and recycled standards so we can finally flip the